The arithmetic didn't work. A single mine weighing just over 2 pounds, packed with less than half a kilogram of explosive, seated flat on the ground. The math said it wasn't enough. The ballistic engineers back in London had run the calculations more than once, checked the tensile strength of tank track links, consulted the field manuals on armored vehicle belly armor, and arrived at the same conclusion each time. One man's device, built around a repurposed commercial tin that looked more a home beneath a kitchen sink than on a battlefield, was not going to stop a Panzer. It wasn't going to stop a Renault. It probably wasn't going to stop a motorcycle with a sidecar if the driver kept his nerve. The numbers were unambiguous, and the men who worked with numbers for a living said so loudly at every meeting where the thing was brought up. Major Hawkins of the Royal Engineers had heard it all. He'd heard it in hallways, heard it across conference tables, heard the polite version from senior officers who couched their contempt in the language of budgetary concerns, and the less polite version from junior engineers who simply laughed. The tin was too light. The explosive charge was too small. The fusing mechanism was theoretically elegant, but practically fragile. The whole concept, they said, violated the fundamental principle that you needed mass and velocity to defeat mass and velocity. You did not stop 40 tons of German steel with something that fit in a soldier's cargo pocket. He kept building it anyway. What happened next? Across the flooded marshes of Normandy's Cotentin Peninsula on the morning of June 6, 1944, was a kind of answer that doesn't require words. It only requires the sight of a German Panzer Mk III sitting motionless 40 yards short of a bridge it never reached, and the long gray line of captured French tanks stretched behind it across a 700-yard causeway, each one representing another calculation that the engineers got wrong. But to understand how a man got from a repurposed floor-polished tin to that image, you have to go back to the summer of 1940, and the particular kind of terror that descends on a nation when it realizes it has almost nothing left to fight with. The soldiers came home from Dunkirk in whatever vessels would float. Fishing boats, ferries, Royal Navy destroyers, pleasure craft whose owners had never imagined their vessels going anywhere near a war zone. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, more than 338,000 British and Allied soldiers were evacuated from the beaches of northern France, and nearly every account of those days includes some version of the same image. Men wading into the water up to their chins, holding rifles above their heads, abandoning everything heavier than what they could carry on their bodies. Field guns stayed in France. Vehicles stayed in France. Ammunition stayed in France. Anti-tank guns, 840 of them, stayed in France. When the last ship cleared the harbor and the mathematics of what Britain had left were finally assembled on paper, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. The island that the English Channel had protected for nearly 9 centuries now had 27 available divisions to defend itself with, and exactly 167 anti-tank guns to equip them. Regulations at one point forbade firing a single round of anti-tank ammunition for training purposes, because there was simply nothing to spare for practice. In Westminster and in the offices of the War Office, men who had spent their careers dealing with the orderly logistics of a major empire now found themselves staring at a problem that had no orderly solution. A German invasion was not merely possible. The evidence suggested it was imminent. Operation Sea Lion, the German plan for crossing the Channel, was being actively planned and actively discussed in captured documents and intelligence intercepts. And the question that occupied every defense planner in Britain, the question that descended on military men like a physical weight, was simply, how do you stop tanks when you have nothing left to stop them with? The answers that emerged from this desperation were, in their own way, a testament to what catastrophe does to the human mind. When orthodox solutions are unavailable, unorthodox ones fill the vacuum with surprising speed. The sticky bomb appeared, a glass sphere coated in adhesive and filled with nitroglycerin, which a soldier was supposed to press against the side of an enemy tank and then run. The number 73 grenade emerged, which was essentially a thermos flask loaded with TNT, blunt and simple, and not particularly precise in its effect. The Home Guard began requisitioning farm equipment. Improvised roadblocks appeared on English country roads. Tree trunks, overturned carts, anything that might slow an armored column long enough for something heavier to deal with it. It was against this background that Major Hawkins submitted his proposal. The year was 1941. The immediate invasion threat had receded. The RAF's performance during the Battle of Britain had persuaded the German High Command that crossing the Channel under air cover was a problem without a near-term solution, but the fundamental shortage of anti-tank weapons remained acute. Hawkins, working with the Royal Engineers Experimental Establishment, had been watching the sticky bomb and the thermos grenade with a particular dissatisfaction of a man who understood both chemistry and geometry. The sticky bomb required you to physically touch the tank, which meant getting close enough to a moving armored vehicle to place your hand on it. The thermos was powerful enough, but clumsy, prone to rolling, and not reliably consistent in its effect against track specifically. What he wanted was something a soldier could use without killing himself in the attempt. Something that didn't require contact with the vehicle itself, but rather contact with the ground beneath it. Something that operated automatically, without a man standing next to it, holding his breath. He found his answer in a floor-polished tin. The tin was a standard commercial container, the kind sold in hardware shops and found under the kitchen counters of middle-class English households. Rectangular, flat, roughly 6 inches long and 3 inches wide. The dimensions were almost exactly right. Hawkins packed it with approximately 1 pound of explosive, either aminal, which was cheap and reliably detonating, or TNT, which was more powerful but harder to come by in the quantities he needed. He fitted the lid with a pressure plate, and beneath the plate he installed a pair of glass chemical igniters, small seal vials filled with sulfuric acid, positioned against a sensitized secondary compound. When the pressure plate was compressed, by, for instance, the steel bogey wheel of a tank rolling directly over it, the plate bent inward, the vials shattered. The acid contacted the sensitive material, and the chain of chemical reaction that followed was fast enough to function as a detonator for the main charge. The whole assembly weighed just over 2 pounds. A soldier could carry a dozen of them in a standard pack without being substantially burdened. The cost of manufacturing each one was negligible. It required no complicated assembly in the field, no special tools, no technical expertise beyond reading a brief set of instructions. And it had, Hawkins insisted, a quality that neither the sticky bomb nor the thermos grenade possessed: versatility. The device could function as a thrown weapon, aimed at the undercarriage of a vehicle that passed at close range. It could function as a conventional laid mine, set into a shallow depression in the earth and covered with loose soil. And it could function as what Hawkins considered its most decisive application: a roadblock element, deployed in what he called a daisy chain. The daisy chain was the insight that made the entire concept work. A single mine, everyone conceded, was not going to destroy a tank outright. Hawkins knew this better than anyone. 0.5 kilogram of explosive against the belly armor of a Panzer IV was not a killing blow. But it wasn't meant to be a killing blow. It was meant to destroy a track. Tank tracks are long, continuous loops of interconnected steel links, each one precision engineered to work in harmony with the others. Sever 3 or 4 consecutive links, or bend them severely enough to jam the driving sprocket, and the track tears free. A tank with a severed track is an immobile tank. An immobile tank on a narrow road or causeway is a roadblock in itself, better than anything you construct with timber or rubble, because it sits exactly where it failed, and no amount of effort by the crew inside can move it under their own power. String 5 mines together at intervals of 2 feet. Lay them in a line across a road at the exact width of an approaching tank's track spacing, and you didn't need 1 mine to do the job. You needed 1 mine to begin the job, and then the physics of momentum and the geometry of a rolling track would carry the vehicle over 2 or 3 more in a fraction of a second before the driver could react. Chain after chain of steel, hammered simultaneously by multiple simultaneous pressure vents, would not merely bend. It would fail. Catastrophically, completely, irreversibly. The engineers who reviewed the proposal looked at the explosive weight and concluded it was insufficient. They examined the chemical igniter and called it fragile and prone to accidental detonation. They noted that the device provided no protection against the driver who saw it in the road, stopped, and led his infantry dismount to clear it safely. They wrote memoranda and submitted reports, and the reports said the same thing the calculations said: insufficient. The term useless appeared in more than one assessment. What the assessments missed, and what Hawkins understood, was the difference between theoretical performance and tactical application. The device was not meant to destroy a tank in isolation. It was meant to operate inside a defensive system, as one element among several, in conditions where the attacking commander did not have the luxury of stopping his column in the middle of the causeway while infantry cleared mines from a road under fire. It was meant for exactly the kind of situation where a German panzer commander, advancing at speed down a narrow elevated road with nowhere to maneuver and enemy rifles pointed at him from every direction, encountered an obstacle he hadn't expected and had to make a decision in less time than his training had prepared him for. It was a weapon designed for the moment when the rule book ran out. Adopted in 1942 under the formal designation Grenade Hand Anti-Tank, number 75, the device entered British Army service without ceremony. Soldiers who first encountered it in training called it the Johnson's Wax Tin, because its flat rectangular profile and the label on its shipping container reminded them of the floor-polished tins their mothers kept in the kitchen cupboard. The nickname spread, and with it a certain skepticism. What kind of army issued its soldiers something that looked like a household cleaning product and told them it would stop a tank? The instructors who ran the mine-laying courses had heard the jokes before and delivered the same response every time. Demonstrate the daisy chain. Show what happens to a test track when 5 of them detonate in sequence. Let the visual evidence do the argument. The jokes generally stopped after that. The mine saw service in North Africa, in Sicily, and Italy. In the cramped, vehicle-dependent fighting that characterized those campaigns, soldiers found applications for it that even Hawkins hadn't fully anticipated. Canadian troops at the Battle of Ortona discovered it made an effective breaching charge for masonry walls, usable in the Mausling technique of urban warfare, blowing holes through the walls of adjacent buildings to move through a town without exposing men to fire in the streets. A small group of partisans reported using a chain of them to destroy a section of railway, placing the flat tins into the web of the track in the knowledge that even a light-gauge locomotive would crush the igniters. The SOE, the Special Operations Executive, Britain's clandestine sabotage network, included it in the standard supply drop kit for resistance groups across occupied Europe, precisely because its size and apparent innocuousness made it easy to conceal and difficult to explain if you happened to be searching for conventional weapons. The Americans characteristically examined the British design, concluded it worked well enough to be worth copying, scaled it up slightly, doubling capacity from a 1-pint tin to a 1-quart tin, and produced their own version, designated the M7 light anti-tank mine. The M7 followed the same chemical igniter principle and was manufactured in substantial numbers before the war ended. The British original remained a slimmer, lighter, and in some respects more elegant device, and it was the British version that the American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions chose to carry into Normandy on the night of June 5, 1944. The briefings for the D-Day airborne operation were specific about the mine. Officers going over final equipment lists with their men noted that each Pathfinder team and demolition group would carry a supply of them. The tactical purpose was clearly stated: roadblocks. The Germans had armor in Normandy, not in the quantities that would arrive once the panic phone call from the coast reached the Wehrmacht High Command, but enough: local reserves, garrison tanks, security detachments with armored vehicles. An airborne force that jumped into the dark without heavy weapons needed something it could put across a road before any of those vehicles arrived, something that required minimal time to deploy and created an obstacle a Panzer driver would be unwilling to push through without infantry support to clear it first. The briefing documents called them 9-inch Hawkins landmines to be used for roadblocks. The phrasing was functional and devoid of drama. Nobody at the briefings was talking about the journey from a polished floor tin to a validated weapon system. Nobody was thinking about the engineering arguments of 1941 or the assessments that called it insufficient. The men who received the mines signed for them, packed them, and climbed into their C-47s without ceremony. Sergeant William D. Owens, 1st Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, was one of the men who came down in the dark over the Cotentin Peninsula in the early hours of June 6. His battalion's objective was Fière Bridge, a stone crossing over the Murderette River about 3 miles south of St. Miraglisse, along a road that led eventually to the Allied landings at Utah Beach. The bridge was one of only 2 crossing points on this stretch of the river, and the ground on either side of it had been deliberately flooded by the Germans, who had manipulated river locks to turn the surrounding fields into shallow lakes and swampy marshland. What remained was a narrow, elevated causeway almost 700 yards long, a single lane of road raised above the floodwaters, lined with trees, with nowhere to move off it in either direction. Anyone crossing it was visible from both ends. Anyone caught on it was trapped. The 505TH's pilots were veterans of the Sicily and Italy campaigns, and they proved it by dropping their passengers with the precision of men who had been to bad drop zones before and learned not to repeat the experience. Lieutenant John Red Dog Dolan, commanding Able Company, assembled 98% of his troopers within an hour of landing. By dawn they had taken the bridge, cleared the Germans from the farmhouse that overlooked the east bank, and were digging it along the gentle slope facing the river. The orders were straightforward. Hold the bridge. Deny it to the enemy. The Germans would try to use it to move reinforcements toward Utah Beach, and if they succeeded, every Sherman tank and infantryman who came ashore in the coming hours would face a Panzer column that had arrived ahead of the schedule the Allied planners had designed around. Hold until relieved, until the beach units broke through, until the battle for the beachhead was decided one way or the other. Major Frederick Kellum, the battalion commander, organized a defense with the economy of a man who knew exactly what he had and what he didn't have. He had bazookas. 2 teams positioned to cover the causeway approaches. He had a single 57mm anti-tank gun, placed on a bend in the road 500 feet back from the bridge, where it had a direct line of fire straight down the causeway. He had machine gun crews, riflemen, paratroopers who had been in this kind of situation before and understood the arithmetic of defensive fire on a narrow front. And he had the mines. Sergeant Owens and his men placed them on the far side of the bridge, where the causeway met the crossing point. Not buried, not disguised. They laid them flat on the road surface, spaced in a chain across the full width of the lane, visible to anyone approaching. Later, Owens would describe the placement with particular clarity of a man who had thought about it. We placed our anti-tank mines right on the top of the road where the Germans could see them, but could not miss them with their tanks. The logic was precise. An enemy tank commander, confronting a visible obstacle on a narrow elevated road with no room to maneuver around it, faces a choice that isn't really a choice at all. He can stop, in which case he's stationary on a causeway, silhouetted against the sky, vulnerable to every anti-tank weapon on the far bank. He can reverse, in which case he's blocking the column behind him, and the German attack collapses back on itself in a mechanical traffic problem that no amount of armor can solve quickly. Or he can advance and hope the mines are insufficient, the charge is too small, the fusing mechanism unreliable. In 1941, the engineers who reviewed the original design had concluded they were insufficient. It was time to find out who was right. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a scout named Francis Buck came sprinting back across the causeway at a pace that communicated everything before he had time to say a word. Behind him, audible before it was visible, came the sound that soldiers in every army in every war described the same way: the clanking, grinding, mechanical rumble of tank tracks on a paved road, low and rhythmic, felt in the chest before it's registered as sound, carrying particular authority that comes from moving approximately 40 tons of steel at the walking pace of a determined infantry advance. The Germans had come, for tanks rolled onto the causeway in column, following the narrow road single file, because there was no other way to move. Behind them, stretching back into the trees on the far side of the Murderette, an estimated 200 German infantrymen advance in the compressed, tree-hugging way of soldiers who understand that the open road in front of them is a killing ground. The combination of forces made the attack look formidable on paper. Armor to break the roadblock, infantry to exploit the gap. The lead tank was a Panzer Mk III, its 60mm frontal armor sufficient to shrug off the .30 caliber machine gun fire that would be waiting for it. Its long 50mm gun capable of reaching the American positions at the far end of the bridge with more than enough accuracy. It rolled forward, and then it stopped. 40 yards short of the bridge, the driver braked. Either he had seen the mines through his vision port, or the tank commander had spotted them from his position and ordered the halt. The turret was still, the engine idling. A hatch opened. The commander stood up. From the American positions, the figure rising from the open hatch was visible against the pale afternoon sky. The silhouette of a man trying to see clearly what was on the road in front of him, calculating whether the things laid across the asphalt were the threat they appear to be, running his own version of the engineering assessment that had been conducted in British offices 3 years earlier. He stood for perhaps 3 seconds. One of Dolan's machine gun crews didn't wait for him to finish the calculation. A short burst at the exposed figure, and the tank commander dropped back into his hatch and did not rise again. With that, the American line erupted. The 2 bazooka teams abandoned their foxholes to get angles on the approaching column, crawling forward on their elbows to position around a concrete telephone pole. Gunner Len O. Peterson and his loader Marcus Heim on the left, Privates John Boulderson and Gordon Prine on the right. Prine had been a rifleman as recently as that morning. The bazooka team's primary gunner had broken his ankle on the jump, and the launcher had been shoved into Prine's hands with the kind of brevity that combat imposes on personnel decisions. He didn't want it. He used it anyway. The bazooka teams went to work on the lead tank. The 2.36-inch high-explosive rockets, each one a tube of shape-charged warhead on a fin body, fired from an open tube by a chemical primer, struck the Mk3's hull in several places before one of them connected with a running gear at the right moment. The track links separated. The tank yawed to one side and stopped moving, not because it was dead, but because it physically could not turn without a track, and the driver had no room on the causeway to compensate. The main gun and the machine gun kept firing. The tank was immobilized but not silenced, and it continued to add to the noise and confusion while the battle for the second and third vehicles developed behind it. The 57mm gun cracked out a round from its position up the road, and the muzzle blast slapped the air with a concussive pressure wave that soldiers learn to recognize even when they're 50 yards from the source. 7 men were killed keeping that gun in operation through the initial assault. They kept it in operation anyway. The second tank, a captured French Renault R-35, repainted Wehrmacht gray, the low-slung profile of a pre-war design conscripted into German service, came up behind the damaged Mk3 and tried to push through. Peterson and Heim advanced toward it, reloading and firing with the rhythm of men who had discovered that there's a state beyond terror, where the hands simply do what they know how to do. They hit the Renault in the turret junction, and then in its tracks, and it too stopped and then began to burn. Black smoke rose from the causeway in a column that could have been seen from the beaches 10 miles away. The Hawkins mines on the road had not yet detonated. The tanks had stopped before reaching them. That was, in a certain sense, precisely the point. They had been placed where the Germans could see them, in the words of the man who laid them, but could not miss them with their tanks. They had forced the first tank commander out of his hatch to assess the situation. That single hesitation, that moment of uncertainty about whether to advance to the minefield, had given the machine gun crew the stillness they needed for an accurate burst. The Panzer Mk III that anchored the causeway, that blocked every vehicle behind it, that transformed the German armored attack into a stationary target range for American bazookas and a 57mm gun. That tank was stopped at least as much by the presence of mines as by the rockets that hit it. The mines forced a pause. The pause was fatal. Through the afternoon and into the evening, the Germans pushed again. The Americans held. The 57mm gun fired its round with a deliberate economy of men who knew they had 6 shells and no resupply coming. Major Kellum was killed in the third barrage, mortar shells walking up the roadside, and find him while he carried ammunition forward to the bazooka teams. Command passed to Dolan, who sent runners instead of radio transmissions because the radios were dead or scattered somewhere across 60 square miles of Norman countryside. Sergeant Owen slithered from foxhole to foxhole, collecting weapons from the dead. A bar here, a second machine gun there, filling in the gaps in the defensive line with whatever came to hand. The Germans committed more tanks. The record would ultimately account for 11 armored vehicles destroyed or disabled across the multiple engagements at the bridge on June 6th and 7th. Panzer Mk IIIs, captured French Renaults, armored cars, vehicles of several types pressing down the causeway in the faith that the narrow strip of elevated road must eventually break through by sheer mechanical persistence. None of them reached the American side. The combination of bazookas, the 57mm gun, the machine guns, the riflemen of the 505th, and the Hawkins mines on a road surface constituted a defensive position that the German armor doctrine of the day had no clear answer to. By the time the last German attack collapsed, the attackers finally waving a Red Cross flag to request a truce for their wounded. Able Company had suffered 17 men killed and 49 wounded. Owens, walking a short distance forward to survey the causeway after the fighting stopped, counted at least 200 German dead or wounded scattered across the 700 yards of elevated road. He sat down and cried. The bridge held. The road to Cherbourg opened. The 7 Corps, Major General J. Lawton Collins commanding, could now move with armor from the Utah Beach perimeter westward and northward across the flooded terrain of the Cotentin. Using the crossing, the 505th PR had seized and held a cost of more than 250 killed and 500 wounded across the entire 82nd Airborne operation. The tactical significance of Fière Bridge in the operational context of the Normandy campaign cannot be understated. It was one of the critical choke points on which the entire breakout from the beachhead turned, and the men who held it did so with the weapons they had brought through the air and the dark, including 9-inch rectangular tins that looked like floor-polished containers, and that the ordnance engineers had called insufficient. The daisy chain lay on the road surface for days after the battle. Soldiers passing through on their way west noted the mines still in position, the causeway strewn with the wreckage of tanks that had never crossed them, a landscape of consequence that needed no explanation. A French family named Leroux, returned to their farmhouse overlooking the bridge's east bank, found their home in ruins and their livestock scattered or dead, casualties of crossfire they had sheltered from in a wine cellar. They rebuilt over 5 years and moved back into their house by Christmas of 1949. The bridge they could see from their front windows was the same bridge. The road it carried was the same road that the Hawkins mines had once blocked. The American military, having watched the device perform, formalized their admiration in the usual American fashion by manufacturing their own version at twice the size. The M7 light anti-tank mine entered production before the war's end, based directly on the Hawkins design, and remained in American service through Korean War and beyond. The British original served until 1955, issued and reissued to forces in every theater where tracked armored vehicles presented a threat to lightly equipped troops who needed something they could deploy quickly and carry without a vehicle. Major Hawkins himself left few traces in the historical record. His rank, his regiment, and his proposal survive in the institutional documents of the Royal Engineers and in the records of the committees that evaluated his design in 1941 and found it wanting. His name attached itself to the device and stayed attached, which is more than most inventors of military equipment can claim, and less than the device deserved. The archives contain no photograph identified as him, no memoir, no post-war interview in which he described what he thought when the reports came back from Normandy, whether he learned the details of what had happened at Fière Bridge, whether he ever read Sergeant Owens' account of placing the mines on the road where the Germans could see them, in the knowledge that the geometry of the causeway made seeing them no better than not seeing them, is not recorded. He proposed a thing that the experts said wouldn't work, and then the thing worked. And then the war ended, and whatever he thought about that went with him wherever he went after. This is how most of these stories end, not with the inventor standing at the site of vindication, watching the evidence pile up in his favor, not with a ceremony, a promotion, a formal acknowledgement from the men who had written the negative assessments. The device works, the battle is decided, the surviving soldiers move on to the next objective, and the man who built the thing from a floor-polished tin goes back to be a major in the Royal Engineers whose name most people can't place without looking it up. What remains is a record, a chain of small rectangular tins laid across a bridge in Normandy on the morning of the longest day of the 20th century, placed on the road surface by a sergeant who understood their purpose well enough to arrange them where they would be most seen, knowing that being seen was not the same as being safe to cross. The tanks that stopped short of them, the tank commanders who opened their hatches to assess a situation that the engineers back in London had already assessed for them, the armored column that never crossed, that burned and smoked on a 700-yard causeway overlooked by a farmhouse where a French family had been sleeping just hours before. The engineers who reviewed the original design were not stupid men. The calculations they ran were accurate. A single mine containing half a kilogram of explosive was not going to penetrate the glassy armor of a Panzer IV. It was not going to kill the crew inside a closed-up, buttoned-down armored vehicle, with all hatches sealed. But a German panzer commander has to open his hatch eventually. He has to see what's in front of him. He has to make a decision on a narrow causeway with nowhere to go but forward or back, with American rifles making backward dangerous and American minds making forward uncertain in a compressed moment of combat where calculations take longer than the situation allows. That moment, that specific, narrow human moment, was what Major Hawkins had designed for. The experts calculated the armor. He calculated the man. If the forgotten ingenuity of men like that matters to you, the ones who looked at a floor-polished tin and saw something the engineers didn't, then share this story with someone who hasn't heard it. Subscribe so these accounts don't disappear back into the silence they were rescued from. And if there's a weapon you think was more unfairly dismissed than the Johnson's wax tin that held the bridge at La Fière, tell us in the comments. We'll look into it.